My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 34, a farmer from Vermont. On the day of my wedding, just before the toasts, my parents stood in front of over 100 guests and called me a lowly farmer who married above his class. They had no idea I'd just signed a multi-million-dollar deal or that their entire mortgage had quietly been paid by the very son they dismissed. The sun hung low over Mirror Lake as I adjusted my tie for what felt like the 10th time. I could hear the breeze rustling through the birch trees surrounding the ceremony site, the lake behind me shimmering with gold. This was it, my wedding day. But instead of nerves or joy, I felt something heavier brewing in the air: disdain. From the corner of my eye, I caught my father, Gerald Brooks, surveying the floral setup with barely concealed irritation. He leaned over to my mother, Elaine, and whispered something that made her roll her eyes. I didn't have to hear it to know it was about the mason jars on the tables or the burlap aisle runner. These weren't their kind of decorations. They weren't country club polished. They were mine. I looked down the aisle. Guests were filtering in, some from my hometown of Barre, Vermont, but most from my parents' circle in Westport, Connecticut. Suits too stiff for the Adirondack air. Polished shoes meant for ballroom floors, not pine needles. The smell of lavender and cedar wafted from the altar, clashing with the overly sprayed colognes of my father's friends. Then there was Jason. My younger brother stood under the white tent, glass of champagne in hand, laughing with a cluster of his prep school friends. He glanced over and caught my gaze, smirking. I saw him lean in and say something, and the group erupted in muffled laughter. One of them made a shoveling motion, and another mimed wiping sweat from his brow. My jaw clenched. Lily, radiant in her simple ivory dress, slipped her hand into mine. Her smile grounded me. Her eyes didn't judge or mock. They reminded me why I chose this life, this setting, and this moment. We stood beneath a wooden arch her father built, adorned with wildflowers she picked herself. "You okay?" she asked gently. I nodded, just waiting for the first punchline. She squeezed my hand. "Let them say what they want. Today is ours." The music started. We took our positions. My heart beat loud, not from excitement, but from anticipation of what would come next. I knew my family. I knew they wouldn't stay quiet long. The ceremony moved beautifully despite the undercurrent of judgment. The officiant, a family friend from Vermont, kept things heartfelt. Lily's vows brought tears to more than a few eyes, mine included. When it was my turn, I kept it simple but real. My words were met with polite claps. No standing ovations. That wasn't this crowd. Afterward, during the cocktail hour, I overheard bits and pieces as I moved through the space. Gerald to a guest, not quite the wedding we envisioned, but quaint. Elaine to another. At least the weather held up. Imagine if it rained on hay bales. I bit my tongue. Jason made his way toward me, at one point glass in hand. Grinning. "Quite the venue, Dan," he said, eyes scanning the handmade signs and wooden accents. "Tell me, did the goats help decorate too?" I smiled thinly. "You know, I almost asked them to officiate." He laughed, then leaned in. "Jokes aside, I hope Lily's ready for a lifetime of dirt under her nails." Before I could respond, someone called him away. I exhaled slowly, wondering how deep they'd go before crossing the line. Lily and I made our rounds. A couple from the farmer's market in Montpelier hugged me tight, praising the ceremony. A neighbor who once helped me dig a trench for irrigation gave me a firm nod. Real people, my people, but I could feel the eyes from the other side of the tent, always watching. I caught Gerald standing near the open bar, talking to a woman in pearls and a tight bun. He gestured around with a grimace and muttered something that made her laugh too hard. Elaine stood with the wives of his colleagues, pointing to the locally sourced menu as if explaining a foreign cuisine. And then there was Jason again, laughing with someone new, miming a cow chewing cud. The sky deepened. Candles flickered to life around the tent. It should have felt magical, but I couldn't shake the chill, not from the air, but from knowing what was still to come. The reception would begin soon, and with it, the toasts. Dinner was winding down when the clinking of a spoon against glass pulled everyone's attention to the front of the tent. My father stood holding his wine glass, clearing his throat in that deliberate way of his. Conversations faded and all eyes turned toward him. Gerald Brooks had the floor. He raised his glass. I knew what was coming. The look on his face was familiar, a blend of forced charm and quiet contempt, the kind he used at board meetings when delivering a dressed-up insult. To my son, he began pausing dramatically, the farmer. A few chuckles scattered through the crowd. I felt Lily stiffen beside me. Gerald smiled as if he'd cracked a clever joke. "Daniel, you've always taken the road less traveled. And by that I mean the dirt road, the one with potholes and fertilizer," he continued. Some guests chuckled uncomfortably. Others shifted in their seats. I glanced at Lily, who gave me a tight smile. I reached for her hand beneath the table. "But in all seriousness," Gerald went on, "we were admittedly surprised when you decided to dedicate your life to plants instead of profits. Yet here we are. You found someone who appreciates that rustic charm." He turned toward Lily. "Lily, you must be a brave soul to sign up for life on a farm. No trust funds, no penthouse views, just fresh eggs and early mornings." My grip tightened. My heart beat louder than the murmurs spreading across the tent. Elaine stood, then placing her hand gently on Gerald's arm, smiling graciously as she picked up where he left off. "Lily, dear," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "you look lovely tonight, and I must say it takes a certain strength to embrace a life so grounded. I admire your courage." Grounded. That word hung in the air, as if Lily had sacrificed status to marry me, as if choosing me meant settling. I felt heat rise in my chest. I looked around. Some guests were smiling awkwardly, others clearly uncomfortable. A few glanced my way, waiting to see if I'd laugh along or if this was still part of the act. Jason leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink with smug amusement. He didn't speak, but his expression said enough. I could almost hear him thinking, "Same old Dan." Then came a voice from the back. A man I didn't recognize muttered a little too loudly, "Tough crowd." A couple of heads turned and someone let out a half laugh that died quickly. Lily's fingers tightened around mine. She didn't need to say anything. Her support was steady, quiet, solid. I stood slowly. I didn't touch my glass. I didn't smile. "Thank you," I said, voice even. "But I think it's time I shared a few words of my own." The tent went silent. Lily turned toward me, concern in her eyes. I stepped into the open space between the tables and the dance floor. I could feel the grass under my shoes, the cool air brushing my neck. My palms were damp. I scanned the room, landing briefly on Gerald and Elaine. Neither looked amused anymore. Jason was watching intently, his smirk gone. I had written no speech. I had no note cards, no practiced lines, but I knew exactly what needed to be said. "It's funny," I began, "how weddings bring out the best and sometimes the truest sides of people." A few nervous chuckles, mostly from Lily's friends. "I'm grateful for everyone who came tonight. It means a lot to Lily and me, especially those who came with open hearts and left their expectations at the door." I glanced at the crowd. A few heads nodded. Some looked down at their plates. I didn't grow up dreaming of soil or harvests. I didn't wake up one day and say, "Hey, let's give up Wall Street and milk cows." Life nudged me in a direction and I followed. I fell. I learned. And eventually I built something. I paused, looking at Lily. She gave me the softest smile. "The farm Lily and I run in Bar isn't just a piece of land. It's 10 acres of belief in ourselves, in community, in work that leaves your hands dirty and your soul full. More than a few guests looked surprised now. I caught Mayor Collins leaning forward, eyebrows raised. We grow specialty produce that now supplies over 40 restaurants across 3 counties. We employ 15 locals. We've hosted school programs, food drives, and this year we signed a partnership with whole and local markets. That got attention. I saw jaws drop, even a soft gasp from someone near the back. Gerald's expression shifted from polite disinterest to calculated concern. I didn't say this to boast. I said it because tonight, for the first time in years, I remembered what it feels like to be spoken about like I'm less. And I won't let that stand. Not here, not today. I looked directly at Gerald and Elaine. Lily didn't marry a farmer. She married a man who built something from nothing, who didn't inherit success but earned it, who chose a path with heart, not just numbers. And that's all I'll say about that. I turned, walked back to my seat, and gently kissed Lily's hand. The crowd was hushed. Then came a single clap, then another, then the tent filled with applause. Jason leaned back, arms crossed, face tight. Gerald picked up his glass but didn't drink. Elaine stared at her plate. I didn't need their approval. I never had. But in that moment I realized something more powerful. I finally didn't want it. I took a slow breath, still standing in the center of the tent. The applause faded, but the energy lingered, humming in the air. I held the microphone in both hands now, not because I needed to, but because it steadied me. There's something I didn't mention, I said, and my voice was calm but clearer now. I figured tonight's as good a time as any. I've spent the last 9 years building our farm in Vermont. It didn't happen overnight. We started with 2 acres and an old trailer that barely ran. I slept in that trailer the first winter with no heat. We lost our first harvest to flooding and the second to frost, but we learned. We adapted. I saw Gerald stiffen, his jaw tightening. We grew from 2 acres to 10, from 3 crops to 30. We started selling at the local farmers market, then small restaurants, then bigger ones. We didn't just grow vegetables, we grew a reputation. Now, as of last month, we've signed a multi-year supply agreement with whole and local markets worth $6.2 million. The tent went silent again. No coughs, no whispers, just silence. I heard someone whisper from the crowd. 6. What Mayor Collins stood, slowly clearing his throat. It's true. Daniel has been working as a special agricultural advisor to the state for the last year. His farm is considered one of the top sustainable models in the Northeast. We're lucky to have him. A few guests actually gasped. I turned slightly and saw Jason's hand grip the edge of the table. I never talked about this stuff before I continued because I never needed to. It wasn't about proving anything. I never wanted recognition. But I realized tonight that sometimes silence allows the wrong version of a story to take hold. I looked straight at Gerald. So here's my version. I am proud of what I do, of what Lily and I built. We didn't inherit it. We created it. With early mornings and late nights and hands in the dirt. Elaine stared at me now, her lips slightly parted. She didn't speak. I turned to Jason. And don't worry, that crop strain you sampled last year for your pitch deck, the one you never asked about. We patented it. Amanda Flores filed it 6 months ago. Just a heads up. Jason's face flushed. He opened his mouth but nothing came out. A waiter passed by, oblivious, setting down fresh drinks. I turned back to the crowd. Thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing not just a marriage but a reminder that the worth of a man isn't tied to where he came from or what label he's given. It's tied to what he does when no one's watching. I handed the microphone to the DJ, who looked more stunned than anyone. Lily rose and came to my side, wrapping her arm around mine. The guests slowly began to applaud again, louder this time. Real, earned. Gerald sat stone still, his wine untouched. Elaine adjusted her bracelet but didn't say a word. Jason's knuckles were white around his glass. I looked at Lily. She mouthed, "You did it." I exhaled. The music started again, softer this time, and people rose from their seats, buzzing with a new kind of energy. One by one they came to shake my hand, to congratulate us, not out of politeness but respect. When I was 18, I stood in our Westport living room holding my college acceptance letter, heart pounding with equal parts hope and dread. Cornell, full tuition minus room and board, I had earned it. Gerald sat in his leather chair, flipping through the Wall Street Journal like it was any other day. Elaine stood near the bay window, cradling her coffee cup like a prop. "Dad," I said, trying to sound casual. I got in. "Cornell, agricultural sciences, I'm in." Gerald didn't look up. "And your brother will be applying to Yale next year." "What's your point, Daniel?" I held out the letter. "They offered me a partial scholarship. I need some help with living costs." Gerald finally looked up. "Help with what? Money for what?" "So you can grow tomatoes for a living." Elaine didn't say anything. She just sipped her coffee and looked outside like the conversation wasn't happening. Jason, 2 years younger than me, got a full ride through college. Not through scholarships, through my parents' checkbook. No questions, no hesitation. So I packed what I had into my old truck and drove to Ithaca. I rented a room above a mechanic's garage the first semester. Second semester I couldn't afford rent, so I bought a beat-up pickup with a camper shell and slept in parking lots. I showered at the gym, ate peanut butter sandwiches, and I studied. God, did I study. Cornell wasn't easy. Most of my classmates came from family farms or private prep schools. I came from rejection. I had a chip on my shoulder and dirt under my nails. One of my professors, Dr. Elise Harmon, saw something in me. She let me assist on her soil regeneration research. I spent nights in greenhouses, weekends knee-deep in compost, and holidays applying for grants. She was the first person who said, "You belong here," and made me believe it. After graduation, I didn't take a consulting job like most of my classmates. I moved to a rural town in Vermont and asked an old farmer named Pete if he needed help. He paid me $12 an hour, offered half a sandwich at lunch, and gave me a shed to sleep in. That first winter was brutal. I shoveled snow off chicken coops, fought frozen pipes, and wondered more than once if Gerald was right. Maybe I was wasting my education. Maybe I should have gone into finance like Jason. But then spring came. The soil thawed, seeds sprouted. I started renting 2 acres from Pete, then 4. I traded labor for equipment. I learned to graft, to compost, to rotate. I called Elise once, nearly in tears, after losing an entire crop of lettuce. She said failure is a better teacher than any textbook. I built everything slowly. I partnered with local restaurants. Got my organic certification. Lily came into the picture 2 years later, looking for volunteer work while finishing her sustainability thesis. She never left. She believed in me before the first big harvest. She believed in me when I was sleeping in the shed and wondering if I had made a mistake. Looking back, I realized that rejection shaped me. Gerald closing that door forced me to build my own. And as I stood at my wedding listening to him question my worth, I wasn't angry anymore. Just done. I had returned to Westport once before the wedding. Just once. It was meant to be quick. A signature on a contract, a brief transaction between brothers. Jason met me at a law office near Main Street, not at the family home. That in itself said enough. He wore a navy suit tailored too sharp for such a casual meeting. I came in jeans and a flannel. He barely concealed the look. "Here to sell off the last piece of your mistake farm," he said, flipping through the papers. I didn't respond. It was a small investment I made in one of his early agri-tech ventures. Nothing massive, just something to keep us connected when we were still pretending that was possible. He leaned back in his chair. "You know, Dan, you're not cut out for real scale. You think too small. You act too sentimental. That's why you'll never run with the big dogs." I signed the papers without comment. No argument, no ego. Just before I left, he passed me a manila folder. "Dad wants you to sign this too," he said. "Estate restructuring. Clean and simple. Said it's to avoid family drama down the line." Inside, I found a waiver stripping me of any future claims to the family trust assets. Properties, everything. A clean break. Elaine had added a handwritten note in the margins. "Better for all of us this way." I stared at the paper longer than I should have. My name printed, my role erased. I signed it, quietly. I placed it back in the folder and walked out. That night, I drove back to Vermont in silence, through rain and dusk headlights flickering off wet pavement. By the time I reached the farmhouse, Lily was asleep. I sat alone on the porch listening to the hum of summer insects and made a decision. I would plan the wedding on our terms, not just in setting but in message. If they saw me as a joke, I'd give them a stage. If they wanted to mock the dirt under my nails, I'd show them where it had taken me. But I wouldn't raise my voice, I wouldn't call names, I would do what farmers do. I'd prepare the soil, then let the harvest speak for itself. That week, I began coordinating with Lily and a small local team to design the wedding ceremony around the farm's identity. The flowers were grown on our land. The meals came from our produce prepared by chefs we had worked with through the co-op. We wanted authenticity, not extravagance. But I also ensured it had elegance, the kind born of care, not money. I reached out to Mayor Collins and invited him to officiate. Not because of his title, but because he had supported our local agriculture initiatives when no one else cared. He agreed. We also invited Tommy Rivera from Whole and Local, who had been instrumental in getting our produce into regional chains. I knew his presence would raise eyebrows. That was intentional. Still, I kept most of it from my parents. They had sent back the RSVP card with a simple attending. No note, no enthusiasm. That told me enough. I remembered a day years ago when I was visiting Westport for Thanksgiving. We were all in the living room and Gerald was discussing the future of the family estate. He said, "This house will be Jason's one day." It was always meant to be passed to the one who carries the name forward. I had been sitting 10 feet away sipping a cider. I asked, "You mean Jason keeps the house and I—" Gerald waved a hand. "You'll be fine. You have your farm, don't you?" That moment stayed with me. It reminded me that my position had been decided long ago, not based on effort or merit, but preference and perception. So when I stood outside that law office, contract in hand, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt confirmed. The writing had always been on the wall. I had just stopped reading it. The rest of the drive home, I made a mental list, not of grievances, but of truths. Things I would no longer expect, things I would no longer chase. I wasn't bitter. But I was done hoping for recognition from people who only saw what they wanted to see. It started with a glance, a familiar curl in the leaves. The distinct green hue that had taken me 2 winters to stabilize. Lily noticed it first on her tablet while we were going over some competitor analyses in the living room. "Daniel, this kale strain, doesn't it look like the one you developed last year?" I looked. My stomach dropped. The pigmentation, the frost resistance, even the stem structure, it was mine. The promotional video came from a startup I had never heard of, a flashy agri-tech venture based out of Boston. But as I scanned their investor list, one name leaped off the page: Harmon Equity Group. Jason had pitched them years ago. I remembered the name from old emails. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. I went out to the barn and pulled the original logs from our seed trials, cross-referencing dates, growth stages, and the proprietary nutrient blends. Amanda Flores had filed our intellectual property protections years back. Every step of my work had been documented and time-stamped. I didn't sleep that night, not from rage but from clarity. Jason hadn't just undermined me, he had tried to profit off what I bled for, quietly, cowardly. By noon the next day, Amanda had everything she needed: emails, growth logs, photos, supplier invoices, dated journals. Her paralegal called it an open and shut case. We issued a cease and desist within 48 hours. The startup removed the product from their catalog within a week. Their website redirected to a dead link. A week later, an investor blog hinted at lawsuits and fractured partnerships. And then Jason found out. He called once. I didn't answer. Then came the email. Short, accusatory. He said I was sabotaging his career trajectory. I forwarded it to Amanda. 2 days later, Gerald left a voicemail. Daniel, I don't know what kind of games you're playing, but you've made things very difficult for your brother. I didn't respond. I wanted to scream, to send them every spreadsheet, every patent certificate, every time-stamped photo, but I didn't. I had learned my lesson. The people who didn't believe you at your lowest rarely cheer when you rise. A week after that, Amanda received word from the startup's legal team. They offered a settlement, quiet, private, but I declined. It wasn't about money. I just wanted the theft to stop. A local farming blog picked up the story from industry chatter. A brief write-up: small-town grower defends seed innovation against corporate interference. My name was only briefly mentioned, but it was enough to start conversation in Vermont's ag circles. Some called to offer support. A few asked if I'd consider partnerships. Jason. He went silent. I heard he skipped a panel he was scheduled to speak at in San Francisco. His LinkedIn profile changed from founder to consultant. Elaine emailed me late one night. Jason is under so much stress, maybe you two can talk, clear the air. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat on the back porch watching the wind ripple through rows of kale, the very ones that had nearly been stolen. The air was cool. The soil beneath those leaves had been turned by my hands, shaped by my choices. For years, I had been the invisible son, the one who quietly paid debts, sent holiday cards, and showed up when needed, but now they couldn't ignore me. They didn't have to like me, but they would have to respect the work. After the applause faded, the atmosphere shifted, not because of volume, but presence. It was as if the weight of my words had settled into the soil beneath everyone's feet. Guests began moving differently, eyes lingered longer, conversations hushed when I passed. Then Tommy Rivera walked over. He moved with purpose, his tailored suit catching the golden light under the tent. He reached out to shake my hand, his grip firm, warm. Daniel, you just made every partner in the room wish they'd gotten in sooner. I chuckled lightly. You're not just growing food, you're growing legacy, I mean that. We talked about the expansion plans, the new distribution model we'd mapped out. I mentioned we were testing soil sensors that would help optimize irrigation for our heirloom tomatoes. Tommy's eyes lit up. He said he wanted a meeting within the next week. Our handshake wasn't just acknowledgement. It was respect. It was validation that years of mud missteps and manual labor were finally seen. A nearby group of guests had overheard. A ripple of reaction moved through the circle. Some murmured about investment potential. Others about the vision. I didn't need them to understand every detail, but they understood the outcome. Elaine approached just as Tommy walked off. She was holding a glass of champagne, not sipping it, just fidgeting with the stem. Your friend seems impressed, she said almost too casually. Business is going well, I replied. She tried to smile. Her tone softened. You know we might have misjudged how serious you were about all this. I didn't respond. Maybe you and Lily could join us for dinner next week. We'd love to hear more about what you're doing. We'll see. Harvest starts soon, might be tight. I didn't promise anything. I'd learned not to offer what wouldn't be respected. Jason lurked on the edge of the reception like a bad mood. He looked smaller than usual. Or maybe I had just grown. He caught my eye and walked over, slurring slightly. So you got your little empire now. Gonna give a TED talk. Make Kale cool. I looked at him. He was drunk, not just from alcohol, but from the sting of being irrelevant in a room that used to orbit him. I said nothing. Silence had more gravity. Later I found him by the lake tie, undone shoes off toes, dipping in the water like he was trying to ground himself. They only clap for you because you make them feel better about their guilt. Not because you're right. He looked at me like he wanted a fight. I gave him none. Inside, a journalist from AgriFuture Monthly had already filed a photo of me and Tommy shaking hands. Lily texted me a link within an hour. The headline read, "Farmer turned founder rewrites the future of sustainable food." The comments were kind, real. They spoke of hope roots and the power of staying the course. Elaine saw the article the next day. She sent me a message with just 3 words. Well done, Daniel. No apology, no reflection. But it was something. Gerald said nothing. Didn't call. Didn't write. And that too was something. The wedding wrapped around midnight. Guests left in small clusters, some still discussing the speech, others the food, a few the atmosphere. But everyone left with something they hadn't expected. Not the spectacle, not the story, but the truth. The quiet of the drive back to Vermont wasn't empty. It was full of aftershocks from the day before. I replayed faces, phrases, glances. Not out of doubt, but closure. As the car wound through familiar roads lined with goldenrod and pine, a strange peace began to settle in my chest. Lily was waiting on the porch. Her smile broke whatever tension was left in my spine. We didn't speak right away. We just stood there, arms around each other, breathing in the late summer dusk. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and lemon balm. We spent the night in soft conversation, eating leftover wedding cake with forks straight from the box. By midnight, I was barefoot on the back deck, watching the stars shimmer above our rows of vegetables like sentinels of everything we'd built. Morning came with the hum of sprinklers and the low clink of Lily moving through the kitchen. I laced up my boots, grabbed a clipboard, and headed out to inspect the eastern plots. Kale, squash, radishes, all pushing against the soil like they knew the world had seen them now. Halfway down row 7, my phone buzzed. I checked the screen and froze. It was an email with the subject acquisition interest, confidential. A firm out of Chicago wanted to purchase the entire operation. The number attached was high, 8 digits. More than enough to start 10 new lives somewhere warm and anonymous. I read the message twice. Then I deleted it. Because this wasn't built to sell. It was built to last. Later that week, as I was logging soil pH results into our co-op database, a silver Subaru kicked up dust near the barn. A woman in boots and a denim jacket stepped out carrying a notepad. She introduced herself as Marla Jennings from the Addison County Chronicle. She'd seen the viral clip of my wedding speech and said it had sparked local interest. "You've become something of a folk hero," she joked. I laughed, wiping sweat from my brow. "Hardly, just a guy with dirt under his nails." She asked if she could walk the rows with me. I agreed. As we moved past the heirloom tomatoes, she asked about the business model, the crop rotation strategy, even the name choices for the new hybrids. Why do it all yourself? She finally asked. With your background, you could have gone corporate years ago. I stopped beside a line of sweet peppers and rested a hand on the top wire of the fence. I grow vegetables, not controversy. She nodded, scribbled the line down, and smiled. We finished the walk and parted ways. She promised the article would be fair. I believed her. That night, Lily made dinner grilled trout with lemon dill potatoes. We ate on the porch, watching the sky shift through colors like an old photograph fading in reverse. Afterward, I sat by the edge of the field with a mug of tea and checked my inbox. Buried between equipment orders and seed catalogs was a message from a young farmer in upstate New York. He'd read about the lawsuit, the speech, and said it helped him decide not to sell his land. He thanked me for proving that doing it the right way still mattered. I sat there for a long time, just holding my phone heart steady in a way I hadn't felt in years. The next morning brought mist and the smell of wet soil. I walked the perimeter of the farm, hands in pockets, letting my feet find every bump and dip I knew by memory. Nothing had changed, but everything had, and I liked it that way. A few days after things had settled, I drove out to visit my grandmother, Ruth. She lived alone in the same two-story house on the edge of Brattleboro that had been in the family since before I was born. It was the place where I'd spent most summers as a kid, digging up worms in her garden and listening to old folk songs crackling from her record player. When I pulled up, she was already on the porch knitting something in salt blue yarn. Her eyes lifted behind gold-rimmed glasses, and she smiled in that way that always made me feel 7 years old again. "Well now, if it isn't Vermont's most famous dirt digger," she said. I laughed and hugged her tightly. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and cedar. We sat at the kitchen table drinking chamomile tea. I told her about the wedding. Not all of it, just enough. She listened without interrupting, then placed her hand over mine. "You don't need to explain yourself to people who don't want to understand you, Daniel. Some folks only see what matches their own mirror." I nodded, throat tight. She'd always had a way of cutting through noise with just one sentence. After a while, she got up and went into the hallway. When she returned, she carried a small leather-bound notebook. "You left this here years ago, thought you might want it back." I opened it slowly. It was my old college journal from Cornell. Notes on crop rotations, business ideas, and scribbled dreams from nights in the dorm when the farm was only a hope. I smiled. I thought I'd lost this. "You didn't lose it. You just hadn't grown into it yet." We sat quietly for a while. Then she looked at me with a softness that carried the weight of generation. "You know, in all this family, you're the only one who's ever done exactly what he said he'd do. You followed through, you built something real. And you did it without ever asking for applause." My eyes burned. I tried to swallow the lump forming in my throat, but I couldn't. "You're a good man, Daniel. That matters more than money or legacy or whatever your father thinks he left behind." She reached out and squeezed my hand again. I didn't pull away. That afternoon, we walked through her garden. She showed me the tomatoes she'd planted from seeds I sent 2 springs ago. They were thriving. I bent down, touched the soil, and felt the warmth of continuity. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, I hugged her goodbye. She pressed a kiss to my cheek and whispered, "Don't ever doubt what you're made of." Driving back home, I kept the notebook on the passenger seat. I glanced at it every few minutes like it might whisper something back. It didn't need to. I already knew. I wasn't just building a farm. I was becoming the kind of man I wished I'd had growing up. The call came just as I was finishing up some field work on a brisk Friday morning. Amanda's voice was calm, but her words weren't casual. Jason had hired a lawyer. Apparently, he was claiming that I had stolen his agricultural IP and passed it off as my own. I stood there, boots muddy, glove in hand, staring at the horizon while Amanda outlined the nonsense. She had already preempted it. The patents were airtight. The licensing documentation contracts, timestamps, digital logs, and the email trail were all clean. We had dotted every I and crossed every T. I knew Jason was desperate, but I hadn't expected him to swing this low. Amanda said the letter she drafted for his legal team would make the point clear back down or risk countersuit for defamation and malicious litigation. He's got no legal footing, she assured me, and his legal counsel should know better. This is a scare tactic. I thanked her, then sat on the porch for a long while watching the wind move through the wheat rows. That anger I used to carry felt distant now. I didn't have room for it anymore. Jason had spent his life trying to outrun my shadow, not realizing he'd created it himself. Later that afternoon, Lily found me tinkering with the irrigation sensors. "Everything okay?" she asked, wiping dirt from her hands. "Jason's lawyer just tried to claim I stole from him," I said. Amanda shut it down. "It's over." She didn't say anything right away, just stood beside me, staring out at the land we'd built together. "You know they're running out of ways to hurt you, right?" I nodded. They already did, and I survived. The next week, we received a formal notice from the law office representing Jason, acknowledging our response and stating they would not pursue further action. The phrasing was stiff, but it was the closest thing to a retreat Jason had ever issued. I learned through a mutual acquaintance that Gerald and Elaine were now struggling financially. Their retirement fund had been depleted, and the house they lived in was still under the lien from a previous loan Jason had taken out to cover a failed sidventure. I didn't gloat. I didn't step in either. I had learned that sometimes letting people face the consequences of their own decisions was the most respectful thing you could do for them and for yourself. That Sunday, Lily and I walked the perimeter of the farm. The leaves had begun to change, signaling the arrival of early fall. She stopped, pulled her sweater tighter, and said quietly, "Do you regret not confronting them earlier?" "No, I just regret expecting them to be different." She slipped her hand into mine and we kept walking. Back at the house, I sat at my desk and opened my Cornell journal again. Inside was a small dried maple leaf I'd pressed there years ago during one of the hardest winters. Scribbled next to it were the words, "Keep going. Even now the seed is alive." I looked out the window toward the hills. No applause, no press, just the steady rhythm of wind and soil. Some truths don't need defending. They just need time to grow. October moved in with soft winds and the scent of pine brushing gently through the trees that lined our driveway. The farm slowed into its autumn rhythm. Fields that once bustled with harvesting were now quiet, resting, waiting for the frost. I found a strange kind of comfort in that stillness. There was healing in how the earth rested without apology. One morning I opened the mailbox and found a pale blue envelope addressed in my mother's familiar script. The handwriting looked older somehow, more careful. Inside was a single sheet of paper, 7 words. "We never understood you. Maybe we never tried. No apology, no explanation, just that." I held it in my hand for a long time. Not because I was unsure of how I felt, but because I knew exactly how I felt. Calm, final. I tucked the letter in the back of a drawer I rarely opened beside old field maps and Lily's first love notes. That weekend I spent hours in the east greenhouse with Lily. We replanted winter greens, our fingers brushing as we passed each other in the narrow aisles. It was a quiet day, but full. The kind where you didn't have to speak much to feel understood. Later that afternoon, Lily brewed tea and we sat on the porch. The sun lowered behind the mountains, casting everything in copper light. She handed me a blanket and curled up beside me. "Have you heard anything from them since the letter?" she asked. I shook my head. I don't think they know what to say next. Do you want them to? I thought about that for a moment, staring out at the tree line. Not really. Some silences are honest. The next day I received an email from a podcast producer. They wanted me to share my viral wedding speech and talk about how I'd built a legacy from dirt. I laughed, then politely declined. What I'd built wasn't meant for sound bites, but the story still found its way out. A small column in a local journal, then a longer feature in a farming magazine. They called it a quiet revolution. The irony didn't escape me. A week later, I stood in the old hayloft, now converted into a library of journals, seed logs, and framed photos of the farm over the years. I ran my hands along the spine of a book labeled 2015. That was the year we almost lost everything to frost, the same year Lily and I built our first hoop house with salvaged plastic and hope. Downstairs, the radio played softly while Lily prepped dinner. The smell of baked squash and sage filled the house. Our dog Maple thumped her tail against the wood floor as I passed by. There was nothing extraordinary about the moment, but maybe that was the point. Peace wasn't fireworks or applause. It was this. On Sunday, we hosted a harvest potluck for neighbors and farmhands. The Brooks farm table groaned with roasted vegetables, warm bread, and homemade apple butter. Children ran between rows of pumpkins while adults sipped cider and swapped stories. No one asked about my family. No one had to. As the evening waned, Lily and I stood by the fire pit. Sparks rose into the sky like little wishes. She leaned into me. "Do you think they'll ever get it?" she asked. "Maybe, maybe not, but that's not on me." She nodded, her grip on my hand firm. I didn't need closure wrapped in perfect words. I had roots deeper than their doubt. I had a life I'd shaped with my own hands. That was enough. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed just because you didn't fit someone else's mold, remember this silence can be its own answer. If this story spoke to you, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths.